The next few steps that we're going to follow in the manual all involve components that are here, visible on the main system board through this hole where we have removed the keyboard. We're going to be taking a look at the fan, the heatsink assembly, the CPU that's underneath this, the CMOS battery, what they call the RTC battery, the real-time clock battery, but it's the same thing, as well as the RAM that we find here right now. This is the original RAM for the machine that came with it. A lot of laptops will do this. They'll have one slot for RAM hidden inside the machine somewhere, and then the rest that you're using to expand or add to the memory of the machine are available through an access panel on the back. So quite common. It used to be all the RAM was hidden under here, and it was really quite a pain to upgrade the RAM. So let's go ahead and remove these components. The first component they have us removing is the fan. This is the fan that cools the entire inside of the laptop. It's a fan that spins in a circular motion sideways, blowing air out the vent on the side. As it does, it's drawing all the air from inside the case through the fan and out past this radiator that you can see right here. And that radiator is connected with copper tubing to this copper plate that's bolted right to the top of the CPU. So this heats up when the machine is working, and the heat transfers through the copper to the radiator. So the air from the fan, in addition to blowing out the warm air from the machine, is also cooling that radiator, helping cool the CPU. 2 screws, Phillips, one on each corner of the fan. They are captive, so they'll stay with the fan, which is nice. So just loosen those, and then if you follow the colored cabling back, you'll see that this connector right here is the one that we need to remove to get this whole assembly out. Usually a couple of fingernails is all you need to grip it around the edge. If you have trouble, take a little flat blade screwdriver and gently work it underneath each side of it until it pops out, and then you can just grip it and pull it out. You don't want to grab the wires and pull, because they're liable to come right out of the socket itself or out of the connector, and then you're out of luck, because they are fairly difficult to fix. Sometimes it's hard because here the case is in the way. It's hard to get around that spot. Work it back and forth a little bit till it pops out, and there we go. So now we've got that connector out. Carefully unwind the wires from the components that it's wrapped around, and then that whole fan just lifts right out. So that's the fan. Set that aside. A lot of times once you have the fan out, you'll be able to see here along the radiator there's quite a big pile of dust bunny material where all the air has been blowing, and the edges of the radiator kind of act as a filter, and they catch a lot of dirt. So if you're not getting good airflow on your laptop, it may be that the fan itself is clogged and not spinning freely, so you can check that. It may be that wherever it's blowing, like through that radiator, also has a lot of lint and other material on it. So that's the fan. That's pretty easy to remove. The next step they have us doing in the book is removing the heatsink. Just fold this tab out of the way. 4 screws. These screws may be fairly tight. They should be tight. And these silver pieces here are actually pretty high strength springs, so there's a lot of spring tension. So you really have to make sure when you take these out, you put your screwdriver in there. You may feel a little bit of play on it, but the next size up screwdriver really doesn't fit all that well. You can see that just the tip of it's in there. So what you need to do is make sure that whichever screwdriver you're going to use for this, you give it a fair amount of downward force so that the screw and the screwdriver don't slip past each other, and then it should spin out fairly easily once you take the tension off of it. You can see how that spring popped up like that. So we'll do the same thing to this one. Just go slow at first. If you feel it pop over and start to slide against it and not spin the screw, you want to stop and readjust, because it doesn't take much with these tiny screws to strip the tops out, and then the next person that needs to work with that screw, namely you, when you have to put it back together, it may not tighten enough. So once those 4 screws are all loose, you'll see that whole assembly is kind of loose, and we can slowly wiggle it up out of position carefully, and that whole assembly comes out. Once again, captive screws, so we don't need to worry about taping them on anything, and now you can get a good look at that radiator that the air blows through. So on the back side, you can see the thermal compound. Originally it was one of the little thermal stickers that goes on there. You can see the paste in the center, and on the CPU, which is this green square here, you can see where that paste was riding. You need to make sure later when we put it back together that that paste is still good and connecting well. It doesn't take much for it to not conduct heat, so we want to be careful about that. So set that to the side. Watch out for the goop. Try to put it goop side up so that you don't get that gray stuff on everything. It will stain your clothes. It tastes terrible. Okay, underneath that now we can see the CPU. As I said, that's the green square right here. What we want to do with the CPU is take that out just so you can see how it works. So we'll use a screwdriver according to the steps in the manual. Right here on this screw, this socket that this CPU is in is really a ZIF socket. So there's a metal plate, a plastic plate that slides and pinches it in place. So that's what this screw is actually going to do. This screw is actually going to slide that plate to the side as we turn it. And it should turn fairly easily, and you'll see that it moves just a little bit. It's moving that way just a touch, and you'll reach a point where it feels like you've probably moved it far enough. A little tension starts to build up. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you turn it that last little click. You can see when I open it up, it stops there, and then a little bit more pressure, and it kind of clicks into place, and then it stops firmly. And as it does that, you can see that this moves, and you can see your CPU rattles around a little bit now, and all you have to do is grab it and lift up. You need to be very careful because the back of the CPU has all these small pins on it. If any of these get bent, it won't go back into place. There is only one way you can put it in. You'll see on the back of the CPU there's a couple pins missing on this corner, and in this corner of the CPU over here there's a couple of pin holes missing. That's where that corner goes, so we set that back in. It just drops right in place. So we'll set that to the side. This one's kind of a hard one to set down because you got the thermal paste on one side and you've got the pins on the other, and you don't want the pins bent and you don't want the thermal paste on anything. So the best bet is to set it thermal side down right back on top of the heatsink where the other thermal compound is, and just rest it there temporarily until we're done and ready to reassemble. Alright, two other components on this side that we're going to remove right now. The RTC or CMOS battery. You can see it's just held in a little plastic socket and a couple of wires that bring it over to this little connector right here. Once again, use a screwdriver to work the ends up, or grab it with fingernails and work it loose, and we just set that to the side. Last component on this side is the RAM. We can see the RAM here in its socket, just the one socket for it. To remove the RAM, what we want to do is we want to take these clips here and push them outward. So with a screwdriver or your finger, push that one over just a little bit, push that one over, and you see as soon as you do, the RAM kind of pops up into place, and then you want to pull it out at that same angle, up and out, and there's your RAM. This one happens to be a PC2 4200, and it's 512. So not a whole lot of RAM in these machines, but they're a little bit older. And that concludes the main parts that come straight off the motherboard.